It was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. The sun shone brightly over a quiet suburban neighborhood, laughter filled the air, and love was everywhere. Marcus and Alana had waited years for this moment, their wedding day. Family and friends gathered in the backyard, music played softly, and children ran around holding flower petals. Everything seemed perfect, until it was. What happens when joy turns into chaos? Not because of crime or danger, but because of prejudice. What would you do if someone called the police on your wedding just because of the color of your skin? Hey everyone, welcome back to Swift Tale, where real-life stories remind us that the truth can be more powerful than fiction. If this is your first time visiting, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because today's story will leave you speechless and maybe even change the way you see the world. This is the story of how one man's dream wedding was interrupted by ignorance, and how a single moment turned an act of prejudice into a powerful lesson for everyone watching. The title says it all. White neighbor called cops on a black wedding, then turned pale when the groom showed his badge. Our story takes place in a peaceful neighborhood just outside Atlanta. Marcus, a respected detective in the city's police department, had spent years serving his community with pride and honor. He wasn't just any officer, he was the kind who believed in fairness, in compassion, and in treating everyone equally. His fiancée, Alana, was a kindergarten teacher, gentle, kind, and the light of his life. Together, they were loved by everyone who truly knew them. But not everyone did. Next door lived Karen, a woman who liked things quiet, predictable, and in her mind, proper. The sight of dozens of cars parked along her street, music playing, and laughter echoing made her uneasy. She didn't know who these people were, and she didn't care to find out. To her, the sound of black joy was somehow suspicious. That's where our story begins, not with a crime, but with a call. A single phone call that would turn a day of unity into a scene of confrontation. And yet, what Karen didn't know was that the man she was trying to humiliate was one of the most respected detectives in the state, a man who had put his life on the line to protect people just like her. So how did a wedding turn into a police scene? How did the groom's simple act of revealing his badge change everything, not just for the couple, but for the entire neighborhood? Stay tuned, because this isn't just a story about a wedding. It's a story about prejudice, perception, and power, and how sometimes the truth doesn't just defend itself, it exposes those who hide behind ignorance. By the end of this story, you'll see that even in moments of pain and misunderstanding, there can be redemption and maybe even forgiveness. So sit back, relax, and let's begin this powerful tale together. Because what happened that afternoon would soon make headlines and remind the world that not every uniform is worn with hate, and not every neighbor sees with love. The morning sun rose gently over the quiet Georgia neighborhood, bathing everything in golden light. The air was filled with the sweet scent of fresh flowers and slow jazz music drifting from the backyard of Marcus and Alana's new home. It was finally happening, their wedding day. After years of love, sacrifice, and patience, the two were ready to promise forever in front of everyone who mattered most. Marcus stood by the mirror, adjusting his navy blue suit jacket, his hands steady but his heart racing. He'd faced dangerous criminals, high-speed chases, and life-or-death moments in his years as a detective, but nothing compared to this. Alana was the love of his life, the calm to his chaos, the reason he smiled after the hardest days on the job. Outside, their friends and family were busy setting up the final touches. Alana's best friend, Monique, arranged the white lilies on each table, while Marcus's younger brother helped the band tune their instruments. Laughter, clinking glasses, and cheerful chatter filled the air. Children ran through the grass holding balloons, their tiny footsteps echoing like music. Everything felt right, everything felt like joy. Neighbors from down the street waved and smiled as they passed by. Most of them knew Marcus well. After all, he was the detective who helped their community countless times, solving thefts, mentoring local teens, and even rescuing a lost dog or two. To many, he wasn't just a cop, he was a hero. But just a few houses away, behind half-closed blinds, another neighbor watched the scene differently. Karen stood by her window, her lips pressed tight, watching the guests arrive one car after another. Her mind buzzed with silent irritation. She liked her neighborhood quiet, orderly, and predictable. She didn't like too much noise, and especially didn't like gatherings that looked to her out of place. Still, for everyone else, the day was perfect. Alana appeared on the porch in her flowing white gown, her veil glowing under the sun. Gasps and smiles filled the crowd. Marcus's eyes softened as he saw her, the woman he'd waited so long for. She looked like everything he'd ever dreamed of. "Ladies and gentlemen," the officiant said, his voice warm and steady, "today we celebrate love, love that sees no color, no fear, no doubt." As vows began, guests wiped tears and smiled. Marcus promised to protect Alana not just as a husband, but as a partner in life's every storm. Alana promised to be his peace when the world felt too loud. Their words weren't just vows, they were poetry born from years of trust and devotion. In that moment, the world seemed still. Even the wind paused as they exchanged rings and sealed their promise with a kiss. Applause erupted, pure, unfiltered joy. Music started again, glasses clinked, and the celebration blossomed. From every corner, laughter echoed, dancing feet tapped, and voices sang in unity. It was a scene of love, the kind that makes you forget the world's cruelty. Marcus's mother whispered proudly, "My baby finally found his forever." Yet in the distance, from behind her window, Karen frowned. To her, the laughter was too loud, the music too much. She muttered to herself about rules, noise levels, and neighborhood standards. She didn't see the love or the meaning, she only saw difference. But for Marcus and Alana, nothing could break their joy, not yet. They danced under the open sky, surrounded by people who loved them deeply. The photographer captured every smile, every tear, every embrace. As the sun began to dip and the golden light turned amber, no one could have guessed that within an hour flashing police lights would replace fairy lights and cheers would turn to silence. Because while everyone celebrated love, someone nearby was dialing a number that would soon change everything. The music grew livelier as evening approached, laughter blending with the rhythm of drums and soft jazz. Guests raised their glasses to celebrate love, family, and a future full of hope. But behind a curtain just a few houses away, a very different mood filled one quiet living room. Karen stood there again, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed, staring through her blinds at the wedding next door. From her point of view, it wasn't a celebration, it was a disturbance. The sounds of joy that warmed everyone else's hearts only seemed to tighten hers. She muttered under her breath, "They've been at it all day. So much noise, this is a residential area, not a nightclub." Her husband, David, sitting on the couch with a newspaper, barely looked up. "Karen, it's a wedding. Let them have their moment." But she shook her head sharply. "It's not about that, it's about respect. There are rules here, noise ordinances, parking limits. Look at all those cars clogging the street, people I've never even seen before. It's getting out of hand." David sighed, he knew this tone. Karen had always been particular about her neighborhood. When a new family moved in, she was the first to check them out, as she called it. It wasn't about curiosity, it was about control. And now, the sight of this joyful black wedding just a few feet away seemed to unravel every comfort she thought she had. As the evening deepened, the celebration grew even more heartfelt. Marcus's father gave a speech that made everyone laugh and cry at the same time. "My boy found a woman who sees him for who he truly is," he said proudly. "Not his badge, not his job, but his heart." The crowd cheered, glasses raised high. But from her window, Karen saw something else entirely, people acting loud, taking over the street, and in her mind, making a scene. She grabbed her phone and started filming. "Just in case," she said to herself, as if she were documenting a crime. Her camera shook slightly as she zoomed in on guests dancing and kids running around the yard. "What are you doing?" David asked, setting down his paper. "Recording proof," she said, not breaking her stare. "If the police come, they'll see I was right." "Right about what? It's a wedding, Karen. You're going too far." But Karen didn't answer. She was convinced she was protecting her neighborhood, protecting it from what even she couldn't explain. It wasn't about volume or parking, it was about fear, the kind that hides behind excuses like property values and safety. Inside the wedding, Marcus noticed a few guests whispering. Someone pointed toward the fence. He turned his head just enough to see Karen's phone peeking through the blinds, recording them. He sighed softly. He knew that look, that watchful, suspicious gaze. He'd seen it too many times before, both on duty and off. But this was his wedding day. He didn't want to let anger ruin it. "Let her be," he whispered to Alana. "She's just looking for something that's not there." Alana squeezed his hand gently. "You sure?" He smiled, trying to keep her calm. "Yeah, tonight's ours. Let's not give her the power to change that." And for a while they didn't. They danced. They laughed. They celebrated harder, louder, freer, because joy, when it's pure, can't be silenced. But as the clock ticked past 7, Karen's irritation turned into obsession. She stood outside now, hands on her hips, glaring at the crowd. The sight of people laughing, people she refused to understand, felt like an invasion. She felt invisible, powerless, and worst of all, ignored. And that's when her mind crossed a line. "Enough," she muttered, pulling her phone from her pocket again. "If they won't listen, maybe the cops will." David stood up, alarmed. "Karen, don't, you'll embarrass yourself. This isn't a crime." But her fingers were already dialing. As she pressed the last number, her face hardened, her voice sharpening into false urgency. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance," she told the dispatcher. "There's a large group of people making noise, drinking, and possibly trespassing. I don't recognize any of them. It's been going on all day." The dispatcher on the other end sounded calm, even skeptical. "Ma'am, is anyone in danger?" Karen hesitated for just a moment, then lied. "I'm not sure, but it's getting out of control." And with that one sentence, a celebration of love turned into a potential scene of conflict. As she hung up, she exhaled like she'd done something noble. She didn't realize that her fear, her prejudice, was about to humiliate her in front of the entire community. Back at the wedding, Marcus lifted his glass for a toast. "To family," he said, smiling, unaware that somewhere nearby, sirens had already been dispatched, heading straight toward him. The music played on, and laughter still floated through the evening air, but miles away, in a quiet corner of the local police precinct, a radio crackled to life. "Unit 712, we've got a noise disturbance complaint at 421 Lakeview Drive. Caller reports a large gathering, possible trespassing. Proceed with caution." To most officers, it sounded routine, another suburban complaint about a party. But for Marcus and Alana, who were still lost in the rhythm of their first dance as husband and wife, it was the beginning of something that would turn their perfect day into a headline. Back in her living room, Karen lowered her phone, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from self-righteous satisfaction. She paced near the window, glancing outside every few seconds. "Let's see how they explain themselves when the cops show up," she whispered, her voice tight with misplaced pride. David sat silently in his chair, shaking his head. "Karen, you've made a mistake," he said softly. "You know what this looks like, right? You called the police on a wedding, on a man who's done nothing wrong." But Karen didn't reply. Deep down, a small part of her knew he was right, but she buried it quickly beneath the layers of fear and entitlement that had guided her decision. In her mind, she wasn't the villain. She was just keeping order. Meanwhile, the sound of tires crunching against the pavement echoed faintly down the street. A black and white patrol car turned the corner, its headlights slicing through the dusk. Two young officers sat inside, fresh-faced, cautious, and unaware of what they were walking into. Officer Ramirez, the driver, glanced at his partner. "Noise complaint," he said casually, "probably just a loud party." His partner, Officer Thompson, shrugged. "Yeah, but the caller said possible trespassing. Better to check it out." Back at the wedding, Marcus was mid-conversation with his mother when one of his groomsmen whispered, "Hey, man, is that?" Marcus turned. Two squad cars had pulled up slowly near the curb. The music didn't stop immediately. The DJ thought it was just late arrivals. But as the officers stepped out, their hands resting instinctively on their belts, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations trailed off, eyes darted toward the street. The laughter faded, replaced by murmurs. "What's going on?" Alana asked, clutching Marcus's hand. He frowned, scanning the scene. "I don't know, but I think someone called them." "Called them? Why?" she whispered, panic rising. Before Marcus could answer, one of the officers approached the gate. "Good evening, folks," he said, voice firm but polite. "We received a call about a disturbance in the area." Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Marcus stepped forward slightly, his expression calm but unreadable. "A disturbance?" he repeated, his tone measured. "Officer, this is a private wedding on private property." The officer hesitated. He hadn't expected such composure. "Sir, we're just responding to a complaint. Do you have identification or proof of residence?" The question hit like a slap. Around them, whispers rippled. The bride's face fell. The bridesmaids froze. Cameras started recording quietly from the crowd, people sensing something wasn't right. Across the fence, behind her window, Karen watched, eyes gleaming. "Good," she murmured. "Maybe now they'll learn to follow the rules." But she had no idea what kind of man she was dealing with, or how quickly her small act of prejudice was about to turn against her. Marcus inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Every instinct in him as a police detective told him to stay calm, to de-escalate. But another part, the human part, burned with humiliation. This was his wedding, his guests, his wife. And yet, in the eyes of someone across the street, he was nothing more than a disturbance. The DJ slowly cut the music. Silence filled the air, except for the faint hum of police radios. The crowd looked to Marcus, waiting. He smiled faintly at Alana, his hand squeezing hers. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'll handle it." He took a step forward, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel, and addressed the officers again, this time with quiet authority. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding, but before we go any further, I think you should know who you're talking to." The officers exchanged a glance, uncertain, cautious. The tension was thick enough to feel in the air. Then Marcus reached into his jacket pocket. Guests gasped slightly, years of fear conditioning making everyone tense. But Marcus's movements were calm, deliberate, and measured. He slowly pulled out his wallet, and inside gleamed the golden badge of a detective with the Atlanta Police Department. The younger officer's eyes widened. "Wait, you're—" Marcus nodded calmly. "Detective Marcus Reed, badge number 7625. And this," he said, gesturing behind him, "is my wedding. The only thing we're guilty of is celebrating love." For a moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to stop. The two officers looked stunned, realizing the gravity of what had just happened. And as Marcus stood there, tall, composed, and heartbreakingly dignified, the camera phones kept rolling, capturing every second of a truth that would soon spread far beyond that quiet little street. Meanwhile, in the window across the way, Karen froze. Her smile disappeared. The color drained from her face, because in that instant, she realized the man she had tried to humiliate was one of the very people she had claimed to trust to protect the neighborhood. And for the first time, Karen didn't feel powerful. She felt small. The air felt heavy now. The once lively music had faded into uneasy silence. Guests who only moments ago were laughing and dancing now stood frozen, clutching their drinks, whispering in disbelief. The flashing red and blue lights painted the wedding in an eerie glow, like a crime scene instead of a celebration of love. Two officers stepped closer, their boots crunching softly on the gravel driveway. "Detective Reed, sir," one of them stammered, his earlier confidence melting into embarrassment. We didn't realize." Marcus held up a calm hand, his voice firm but controlled. "It's all right, officer. You were just responding to a call. I understand how it works." He glanced briefly toward the row of houses. "But I'd like to know who thought a wedding was a disturbance." Behind the fence, Karen's heart pounded. She was still watching from her window, clutching her curtain like it could protect her from what she'd done. For the first time, she wasn't angry, she was afraid. The realization hit her like ice water. She hadn't just called the cops on her neighbor, she'd called them on a police detective. Back in the yard, the scene was surreal. The bride, still in her white gown, stood beside Marcus, her face pale and confused. "Why would someone do this?" Alana whispered. "We didn't hurt anyone." Marcus turned to her gently. "Because sometimes," he said softly, "people see what they want to see, not what's real." The officers looked visibly uncomfortable. They exchanged quick glances before one of them finally spoke. "Sir, we're sorry for the interruption. We received a report of possible trespassing and noise disturbance, but clearly this is a wedding," Marcus finished for him, his tone steady but edged with quiet disappointment. "You did your job. I just hope, next time, someone thinks twice before assuming celebration means trouble." The officer nodded slowly. "Yes, sir, understood." Around them, the guests began to murmur again. Some were angry, others just stunned. A few pulled out their phones, still recording. The entire moment, the flashing lights, the tense standoff, Marcus standing there in his wedding suit holding a police badge, was being captured from every angle. An older woman, one of Alana's aunts, stepped forward, shaking her head in disbelief. "Even on his wedding day," she said aloud, voice trembling, "even when he wears the same badge as them." The words cut through the silence like a blade. The officers looked down, visibly ashamed. Then Marcus took a deep breath and faced the crowd. "Everyone," he said, raising his voice slightly so all could hear, "let's stay calm. This isn't how our story ends, not today." He turned back to the officers. "Would you like to stay for some cake?" he said suddenly, his voice laced with gentle irony. The officers blinked, caught off guard. One gave a small, awkward smile. "No, sir, that won't be necessary." Marcus nodded. "Then I'll let you clear the call." The younger one quickly radioed back to dispatch. "Unit 712, responding to 421 Lakeview Drive, no disturbance found, just a wedding celebration. Scene is peaceful, we are clearing." The radio crackled back, "Copy that." And just like that, the lights began to fade. The sirens switched off, leaving behind a strange, humming quiet, the kind that feels almost sacred after chaos. The officers walked back to their cars, visibly humbled, nodding respectfully toward the guests as they left. When the last car disappeared down the road, the crowd broke into applause. It wasn't loud or wild, just a wave of relief and solidarity. Marcus exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment. He'd handled arrests, interrogations, and shootouts, but this felt heavier. This was personal. Alana wrapped her arms around him, resting her head against his chest. "You okay?" she whispered. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but I'll never forget this day, not for the reason I wanted to, though." A few guests approached, offering hugs, words of pride, and even tears. "You handled that like a king," one of Marcus's friends said. "Calm, controlled. You didn't even let them see you flinch." Marcus smiled faintly. "That's what they expect, for me to lose control, but not today." As the music slowly began again, a new energy filled the space, not just celebration, but defiance. People danced not just to be happy, but to reclaim the moment that prejudice had tried to steal. Under the soft lights, Marcus and Alana took each other's hands once more. "Let's finish our first dance," she whispered. They swayed gently, surrounded by their family and friends, stronger now, somehow more united. The moment had scarred them, yes, but it had also revealed something powerful, the grace to rise above ignorance without losing dignity. Across the street, in the darkened window, Karen sank onto her couch, trembling. The sound of faint music carried through her walls again, this time softer, steadier, and strangely haunting. For the first time, she wasn't angry about it. She was ashamed. She turned off her lights and sat in silence, the echo of her own decision playing back in her mind like a bad dream. She had wanted control, but all she had created was humiliation. And the man she tried to shame had responded not with rage, but with grace. The night went on. The guests laughed again, children played, and love triumphed over bitterness. But the story wasn't over yet, because by morning, this moment would no longer belong to just them. Someone had captured it all. And soon, the whole world would see. By sunrise, the quiet neighborhood of Lakeview Drive was no longer quiet. The night's tension had traveled far beyond its white fences and manicured lawns. It had spilled onto millions of screens across the world. It started with a single video, a guest's shaky phone footage, uploaded with the caption, "Cops crash black wedding, but wait till you see who the groom is." The clip showed everything: the flashing lights, the police officers approaching, and then the moment Marcus calmly pulled out his badge. The internet devoured it. Within hours, it was everywhere. News outlets replayed it in slow motion, talk shows debated it, and hashtags began to trend: Detective Marcus, Wedding Justice, Grace Under Fire. Comments poured in by the thousands. "Man handled that like a boss. This right here is how you keep your cool under pressure. The neighbor who called better move. She just made a detective's wedding go viral." By the time Marcus woke up, his phone was vibrating non-stop. Missed calls, notifications, messages from old friends, even from his captain. Alana was sitting on the edge of the bed scrolling through her phone, eyes wide. "Babe," she whispered, "you're all over the internet." He rubbed his eyes. "What?" She turned the screen toward him. There he was, standing in his suit, badge in hand, eyes calm under flashing lights. 1 million views, 5 million, 10. Marcus sighed, leaning back against the pillow. "Of course," he muttered, "we couldn't even get through our wedding without becoming someone's headline." But Alana smiled softly. "At least they're seeing the truth, the world seeing how strong you are, how wrong they were." Meanwhile, just a few doors down, Karen sat in her living room, staring at her phone like it was a loaded weapon. She had seen the same video. Except for her, every second of it felt like a confession. Her name wasn't mentioned yet, but the internet was quick. Someone had noticed her face at the window in the reflection of the footage. Someone else had posted screenshots, captioning them, "The neighbor who called, caught watching." Her comment section turned into a battlefield. "How dare you call the cops on a wedding? People like you are the reason this stuff keeps happening. You should be ashamed." Her phone buzzed with calls she didn't answer. Her job email pinged with urgent HR notice. The world that had once felt so comfortably small, her porch, her gossip group, her tight little routine, suddenly felt like a cage closing in. Outside, news vans lined the street. Reporters knocked on doors, filming segments about racial bias in suburban America. A few guests from the wedding gave interviews, sharing how terrifying and surreal the moment had been. By noon, Marcus's department released a statement praising his professionalism. Detective Marcus Taylor demonstrated restraint and leadership in a situation that could have easily escalated. We are proud to have him serve our city. The comments section exploded with support. Memes appeared. Fan pages popped up overnight. People started calling him the calm detective. Alana, however, felt a mix of pride and unease. She knew her husband wasn't the kind of man who sought fame, he sought fairness. And now, they were both public property. Cameras followed them to the grocery store. A talk show host offered them an interview. Brands sent offers. Marcus declined them all. "I'm not turning my pain into promotion," he said quietly. "This isn't about fame, it's about truth." But truth, as it turned out, was spreading faster than either of them could control. Karen's identity leaked that evening. Her name, her address, her social media, all public. And while many condemned her actions, others took it too far. She received threats, hateful messages, even vandalism. Her car was keyed. Someone spray-painted "racist" across her fence. She cried for hours, hiding behind locked doors. The same world she had weaponized with a phone call had turned its eyes and its anger back on her. Then one night, there was a knock at her door. She froze. Slowly, she opened it, and there stood Marcus. He wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a jacket. Calm, steady, the same quiet authority that had gone viral. "Detective," she stammered, her voice trembling. I didn't expect." "I know," he said softly. "I just wanted to talk." Karen hesitated, guilt twisting her expression. "You shouldn't be here. people are angry at me. I know, Marcus replied. That's why I'm here. He paused, looking her straight in the eye. You made a mistake, a bad one, but the world doesn't need another villain right now. It needs people who can admit when they're wrong. Tears welled up in her eyes. I was scared, she whispered. I thought something bad was happening. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I believe you, Marcus said. Fear makes people do stupid things, but fear doesn't excuse ignorance. What you do next, that's what matters now. She nodded, covering her mouth as she began to cry. I'm sorry, she said through sobs. I'm so sorry. Marcus gave a faint, tired smile, then start by saying that publicly. The next morning, a video appeared online. It was Karen, makeup smudged, eyes red, speaking into her phone camera. I was the neighbor who called the police. I made an assumption based on color, and it was wrong. I hurt good people, I'm sorry. The clip went viral too, but this time not with hate, with mixed reactions. Some forgave, others didn't. But it started a conversation bigger than her street, bigger than her shame. And Marcus, he stayed quiet through it all, because he knew the real work wasn't done online. It was in hearts, homes, and choices people made after the headlines faded. But deep down, one truth burned brighter than ever. Sometimes grace can be louder than revenge. In the weeks that followed, Lakeview Drive was no longer the peaceful suburb it once claimed to be. What had begun as a wedding turned into a national debate, one that split neighbors, friendships, and even families down the middle. Some people applauded Marcus for how he handled the situation, calling him a hero of restraint and dignity. Others accused him of embarrassing the department by humiliating fellow officers in front of cameras. Karen's apology had gone viral too, but while some praised her courage for admitting her mistake, others weren't ready to forgive. The once harmonious community Facebook group became a war zone. Posts read, "He's a good man who showed grace, learn from him." Others snapped back, "She apologized, how long will you keep punishing her?" The conversations revealed something deeper, a country still struggling to face its reflection. Through it all, Marcus kept his silence. He went back to work, returning to the same badge that had caused so much chaos, the same badge that symbolized both justice and judgment. His captain called him into the office one morning. "Marcus," he said, closing the blinds, "you know the brass wants this to go away quietly. They don't want another press wave." "I'm not seeking one," Marcus replied calmly. "I know, but people are watching, everything you do, every word you say. Just keep your head down for a while." Marcus nodded, though inside he felt a quiet ache. Why should truth need silence to survive? Meanwhile, Karen was facing her own reckoning. Someone had filed a harassment complaint, one of the wedding guests who'd been terrified that night. The case wasn't criminal, but it was serious enough to land her in front of a judge. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches. Cameras flashed as Karen, pale and trembling, stood at the defense table. Marcus and Alana sat quietly in the back, not for revenge, but to see how this chapter would end. The judge, an older black woman named Judge Robinson, glanced through the file before looking up. "Mrs. Hale," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you've admitted to calling the police based on assumptions that turned out to be false. You've apologized publicly. Now the question before this court is, what should justice look like for you?" Karen's attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client is deeply remorseful. She's endured public shame, job loss, and threats. She's suffered enough." Judge Robinson leaned back. Suffering is not the same as accountability. The courtroom went silent. The only sound was the faint clicking of cameras. Then something unexpected happened. The judge turned her gaze toward Marcus. "Detective Taylor, I see you're here. Would you like to make a statement?" Marcus stood slowly. The crowd hushed, expecting anger, condemnation, something loud, but his voice was quiet, steady. "I didn't come here to punish anyone, Your Honor," he began. "That night wasn't just about one woman calling the police. It was about what fear does to people and how easily we let it guide us." He looked at Karen, her eyes red and glistening. What she did hurt. It humiliated my wife, my family, and me. But I also know that if I respond with hate, then I become part of the same cycle I've spent my life trying to break. Judge Robinson nodded slowly. And what would you like to see happen here, detective? Marcus took a deep breath. I don't want her fined or jailed. I want her to serve, to understand. Let her work with community groups, attend bias training, help with events that build bridges instead of walls. Let her use her voice to teach others how quickly fear can destroy what love tries to build. The room fell utterly silent. Even the reporters paused their typing. Corinne's lawyer turned to her, stunned. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "You'd forgive me." Marcus looked at her with that same calm strength that had captivated millions online. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It just gives both of us a chance to heal. Judge Robinson leaned forward, her expression softening. I think we can all learn from this moment. She tapped her gavel lightly. Community service and educational outreach approved. Case closed. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some applauded quietly. Others just sat, absorbing what they'd witnessed. As everyone filed out, Corinne approached Marcus hesitantly. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do that." He smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for us, all of us." Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Microphones, questions, flashing bulbs. Everyone wanted a quote. But Marcus simply raised a hand and said, "This story isn't about hate. It's about what happens when we choose to rise above it." And with that, he walked away, not as a headline, not as a symbol, but as a man who had turned pain into purpose. Weeks passed since the courtroom hearing, and for the first time in months, Lakeview Drive began to breathe again. The chaos had quieted, the cameras had left, and the whispers had softened into something else, reflection. The once divided neighborhood began to look different, not because the houses had changed, but because the people living inside them finally started seeing beyond the fences. Marcus and Alana often took evening walks together. Where there used to be silent stares, now there were hesitant smiles, nods, and quiet greetings. People who once looked away now waved. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One afternoon, Marcus found himself standing outside Corinne's house. The white paint was peeling in spots, the garden unkept since the scandal broke. For a moment, he almost walked past. But then the door opened, and Corinne stepped out with a small cardboard box in her hands. "Detective," she said softly, setting the box down by the porch. "You're just in time." Marcus frowned slightly. "For what?" She smiled a small, nervous smile and opened the box. Inside were colorful balloons, ribbons, and a banner that read, "Community Unity Day, all are welcome." "I figured," she said, voice trembling slightly, "if I could tear this neighborhood apart with one phone call, maybe I can help rebuild it with one event." Marcus smiled, touched by the sincerity in her tone. "That's a good start." And it was. Within a week, Lakeview Park, once the scene of cold stares and quiet tension, began to buzz with preparation. Families volunteered. Kids painted signs. Alana designed flyers that read, "Neighbors, not strangers." Corinne worked side by side with families she'd once avoided, her hands trembling as she handed out food, paint brushes, and laughter she hadn't felt in months. When the day finally came, the park was alive. Music filled the air again, not the fearful kind that caused complaints, but joyful sounds that brought people together. Barbecue smoke mixed with the scent of flowers. Tables overflowed with dishes from every culture on the block. A small stage was set up, and at its center stood Marcus, holding a microphone. The crowd grew quiet as he looked around, faces of all colors, ages, and backgrounds. "I never thought I'd see this," he said, "a neighborhood that went from fear to family." He paused, his gaze landing on Corinne, who stood among the volunteers, smiling timidly. "We all make mistakes, but what matters is what we do after, how we rebuild, how we listen, how we love anyway." Applause filled the park. Some people cried. Others simply stood, holding hands, understanding the weight of what was being said. Then Corinne stepped forward. She took the mic, her hands shaking. "I used to think being a good neighbor meant keeping my distance," she said. "Now I know it means opening my heart." The crowd cheered, not because she was perfect, but because she was trying. That night, as the sun dipped below the trees, fairy lights twinkled across the park. Children ran around barefoot, couples swayed to slow music, and laughter, the same sound that once caused division, now echoed like healing. Marcus stood quietly at the edge of the field, watching. Alana slipped her hand into his. "Feels different, doesn't it?" she whispered. He nodded. "It feels right." Nearby, Karen helped an elderly black couple set up their chairs. When she accidentally dropped a plate, they laughed with her, not at her. Small moments, but powerful ones. As the night deepened, Marcus climbed back onto the stage one last time. "This," he said, raising his glass, "is how change begins, not with anger, but with understanding, not with a call for division, but with an invitation to unity." Everyone raised their cups, their candles, their hearts. For the first time, Lakeview Drive wasn't just a place where people lived next to each other. It was a place where they lived with each other. And as the lights flickered and the stars shimmered above, Marcus whispered to Alana, maybe that wedding day wasn't ruined after all. Maybe it was the start of something bigger. She smiled. Maybe it was meant to happen exactly this way. Because sometimes the most powerful stories of love aren't written in romance. They're written in redemption. Months passed, but the story of Marcus Taylor and the Lakeview incident refused to fade. What was once a local scandal had grown into something larger, a symbol of restraint, understanding, and quiet courage. The video of Marcus showing his badge was still circulating online, but now it wasn't just a viral clip. It had become part of lectures, diversity workshops, and even police training seminars across the country. Professors called it the Taylor example. Students debated it in classrooms. Activists shared it as proof that empathy could coexist with authority. Marcus had never sought the spotlight, yet somehow it kept finding him. News outlets reached out for interviews, but he turned most of them down. "I didn't do it for fame," he told one reporter who caught him outside the precinct. "I did it because that's what decency looks like when it's tested." Still, his captain insisted he attend a city ceremony one afternoon. "It's not optional, detective," he said with a grin. "Just wear your good suit." The ceremony was held at City Hall. Rows of uniformed officers filled the seats, alongside civic leaders and community members. Marcus sat quietly in the front row, Alana's hand resting gently in his. When the mayor stepped onto the stage, his voice echoed through the hall. "In times when division and anger run deep, some people remind us what integrity truly looks like. Today, we honor Detective Marcus Taylor for exemplifying calm in crisis and compassion in conflict." The audience stood in applause. Cameras flashed. Marcus looked down, humbled, his hand instinctively brushing the badge on his chest, the same one that had caused fear and misunderstanding, but also brought light when used with empathy. As he walked up to the podium, the mayor extended a plaque, a gleaming gold plate engraved with the words, "For bridging hearts when others built walls." Marcus took a deep breath before speaking. His voice was steady, but filled with emotion. "I've been called a lot of things since that day, a hero, a fool, a symbol. But the truth is, I'm just a man who didn't want hate to win." He paused, looking out at the audience, officers, neighbors, strangers, all listening closely. "When my neighbor called the police on my own wedding, I had a choice. I could have let anger speak for me, but I realized something in that moment. Anger is easy. Grace takes strength." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," he continued. "It means refusing to carry poison in your own heart. That's what my father taught me, and that's what this badge should stand for, not just power, but peace." Alana smiled proudly from the front row, tears glistening in her eyes. As the audience rose again in applause, something unexpected happened. Karen stood up too. She had been sitting quietly in the back, unnoticed until now. Her hands trembled as she clapped, tears streaming down her face. Marcus met her eyes, and in that moment, the crowd seemed to disappear. It was just two people, once divided by fear, now connected by forgiveness. After the ceremony, reporters surrounded him again, microphones flashing, voices overlapping. Detective Taylor, how does it feel to be called a national hero? Would you change anything if you could go back? What message do you have for America? Marcus smiled faintly and said, "Forgiveness isn't weakness, it's the strongest thing a human being can offer. If this story taught me anything, it's that healing begins when one person chooses to stop the cycle of hate." The clip aired on national television that night. People across the country and even overseas watched and shared it. Some cried, some felt convicted, some picked up their phones to call someone they hadn't spoken to in years. Meanwhile, back in Lakeview, the Community Unity Day became an annual tradition. Every spring, families of every background gathered at the park to celebrate together. Food, laughter, music, and stories replacing the bitterness that once divided them. Karen became one of its main organizers. She no longer hid behind her blinds. She opened her doors, volunteered at schools, and worked with local organizations to build awareness about bias and empathy. Her friendship with Alana grew quietly, genuinely. One evening, after the second Unity Day, Marcus stood near the edge of the park, watching children play under strings of lights. Karen approached him with a plate of food and a shy smile. "I still don't think I deserve any of this," she said softly. Marcus smiled, his eyes kind. "That's what makes it real. You're not trying to deserve it. You're just doing better, and that's enough." They stood in silence for a while, listening to laughter echo across the park. "Detective Taylor," she said, looking out at the families dancing, "you didn't just forgive me, you changed me." Marcus looked up at the sky, where the stars were beginning to shimmer. "We all changed," he said quietly. "That's the point. Because forgiveness, when given freely, doesn't just heal one person, it transforms everyone it touches." And that was the real honor, not the plaque on his wall, not the ceremony, but the invisible bridge built between hearts that once feared each other. Time passed quietly after the storm. The headlines faded, the cameras disappeared, and life on Lakeview Drive found a new rhythm, one built not on suspicion, but on trust. The neighborhood no longer whispered about that wedding, they spoke about that change. The park that once echoed with laughter, only to be interrupted by sirens, now held something sacred, the sound of unity. Children who had watched their parents argue over fences now grew up seeing those same parents sharing food, trading recipes, and planning the next community day together. Marcus and Alana's wedding photos hung proudly in their living room, framed by sunlight and peace. But next to them hung another photo, a candid shot from Unity Day, Marcus, Alana, and Karen laughing together over plates of barbecue, a moment that captured more than smiles. It captured healing. On quiet mornings, Marcus sat on his porch with coffee in hand, reflecting on everything that had happened. Sometimes he'd still hear distant echoes of that night, the sirens, the murmurs, the tension, but they didn't sting anymore. They reminded him of how far they'd come. He thought about Karen often, how one fearful call had rippled through countless lives, and how a single choice to forgive had rippled back, stronger. One afternoon, a reporter reached out for a follow-up interview, asking, "Detective, what do you think people should take away from your story now that it's all said and done?" Marcus smiled thoughtfully. "That love doesn't need to shout to be powerful," he said. "That strength isn't always about standing tall. Sometimes it's about standing still when your pride tells you to fight. And that healing doesn't begin when people are perfect. It begins when they're honest." The interviewer asked one final question. "Do you think forgiveness really changes anything?" Marcus looked into the camera, his eyes calm, warm, unwavering. It already did. That clip, simple, short, and sincere, was shared millions of times. But for Marcus, fame no longer mattered. What mattered were the quiet knocks on his door, people from across the city, even strangers, coming to thank him, not for being a detective, but for being human. Months later, during a Sunday service at a small church, Marcus was invited to speak. He looked out at the crowd, a mix of faces, every color, every age, and said softly, "When hate showed up at my wedding, love refused to leave. That's the story I want my children to remember." Applause filled the room, not loud and wild, but steady and heartfelt. Afterward, Alana walked up beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You think the world's learning?" she asked. He nodded, one heart at a time. Outside, the sky was painted gold with sunset. Karen stood nearby, talking with Alana about volunteering for the next Unity Day. They laughed together, two women who, months ago, stood on opposite sides of fear, now sharing hope. And as the scene faded, the camera of life zoomed out, showing a neighborhood once divided, now whole. A place that learned that sometimes the hardest stories lead to the most beautiful endings. Because forgiveness is not the end of a story, it's the beginning of a better one. And that's how a single act of understanding changed an entire neighborhood forever. What started as a moment of prejudice ended as a story of peace, growth, and grace. It reminds us all that sometimes the strongest justice isn't served by anger, it's served by forgiveness. Pause, then a gentle tone shift to audience. If this story touched your heart today, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Swift Tale, where we bring you powerful, true-to-life stories that inspire and remind us of the goodness still left in the world. Drop a comment below. Would you have forgiven if you were in Marcus's place? What would you have done? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and remember, love always wins.